Still another, even more remarkable manuscript that was done this time already under Charlemagne's successors is the so-called the Gospel Book of Ebbo, the Ebbo Gospels, which were done under the patronage of Ebbo, who was an archbishop of Reims. It has, again, it has the acanthus leaves here, as we saw in the other Bible, and the initial letter, as in all the manuscripts, is extremely important because the Word was God and God was the Word, and the initial letter of a Christian scripture conveys the majesty and divinity of the Christian message. This is in fact the page of St. John, and the only reason we know it is St. John as opposed to 3 other evangelists is because we see an eagle right here. And the idea here is that the eagle is the messenger of God, and in fact conveys to St. John what he must write here. And St. John as such is looking over at the eagle as the divine messenger and repeats his words. In other words, these scriptures were not written or thought of by a human mind or human hand. These images are direct messages from God, and that's what's conveyed here. The style, while it continues, the Carolingian classical style, suddenly is imbued with this enormous energy and vivacity. It's almost as if a squall went by and disturbed the evangelist's toga, his hair, everything around him. You can see it even better with Saint Matthew. And the Saint Matthew, we do see an angel right here. So we know that the first one was Saint John, but this one is Saint Matthew because his attribute is this little angel. So it is still in a classical tradition, but the classical calm of the Coronation Gospels is here replaced with this incredible just frenzy of energy, as we see here. There's this vibrant emotionalism of the Carolingian art. It's almost as if the 300 years that passed before, that passed in the absence of learning, absence of writing, absence of any culture to speak of, suddenly burst out in this new expression that took place under the Carolingian monarchs. The figures in these Gospels are represented in these very nervous, very agitated poses. It's as if they just can't wait to put down the message. It's just that the message is so extraordinary, it's so remarkable, it has to be immediately memorized and immediately written down. The streaky, vibrant style and the brushstrokes are also very swift. This particular style, in fact, influenced manuscript illumination style for centuries to come. What will happen with what happened, in fact, with Charlemagne is that he, in a way, he saved Western culture, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, with the destruction of libraries, with destruction of classical manuscripts that really disappeared, learning disappeared, reading, writing, all of it disappeared. With Charlemagne's interest, renewed interest in classical antiquity, he saved European culture by the skin of its teeth. Charlemagne, in other words, stopped the precipitous downfall of European culture. It will never, ever, ever descend as low as it had before him. And we are quite grateful to him, of course. This style, this particular style of this vibrant energy is very visible in another spectacular piece of writing, and that is called which is called the Utc Psalter. The Bible itself, the full Bible consists, of course, of the Old Testament. It consists of the New Testament, Acts of the Apostles, the letters of Saint Paul, the Psalter. It's a very, very large piece of work and would be incredibly, very, very expensive to copy it as a whole. And as a result, various parts of it were copied, and thus we have the Psalters, or just the Gospels, the Gospels of the four evangelists. In fact, very few monasteries owned the full book of the Bible. The Psalter is a volume from a Bible. It contains the book of Psalms, often with some other devotional material and bound together. It could also have the liturgical calendar in it, the litany of the saints, and in the late Middle Ages there will emerge the so-called Book of Hours that will serve the same purpose. It will have the calendar, it will have the litanies, but until then Psalters were the books that were most often owned by the wealthy people, as opposed to the entire Bible, for instance. And they were also commonly used in learning how to read. So they were the ABCs of teaching. Many of them were very richly illustrated, and some of them include some of the most spectacular examples of medieval art. And this one, the Utc Psalter, is one of the greatest of them. It was written, painted in the early 9th century in the Benedictine Abbey of Otto I, which is near Reims, and again under the initiative of the Bishop Ebbo. So it comes under the same patronage as the Ebbo Gospels, and as a result has very much the same, well, very similar style. He was bishop and foster brother to Emperor Louis the Pious, who was a successor of Charlemagne. There are 150 psalms, and they are all illustrated with these incredible pen drawings that cover the entire width of the page. And they too are steeped in classical tradition, but again, instead of very calm, very balanced tradition, this is all very energetic and very moving. But it belongs to the so-called Carolingian Renaissance. So this is our first Renaissance. Renaissance is the revival of classical antiquity, and in this case, the first Renaissance happened under Charlemagne and his successors, who were all very eager, very keen in reviving the classical antiquity, obviously not in its pantheistic forms. They very much were Christian, but in its desire for learning and the desire for the improving of men's mind. Here is the illustration, here is the close-up for you to see. You can see how quickly the designs are done. Whoever is doing it is very comfortable with conveying space. The space is no longer two-dimensional, it is no longer compressed into just into two dimensions, but very much a three-dimensional space. We have the foreground with the military tents, the middle ground, a bit of a background. We can see that everything takes place in front of a city that is similar perhaps to the Roman military camps that they had built. And whoever did it also was very comfortable with human attitude and the fluidity of human movement. All these manuscripts, again, exhibited beautiful, absolutely spectacular, remarkable covers. And here is still another cover. This one comes from Lindell Gospels that was contemporaneous with the Utc Psalter and the Lindell Gospels. And here we see again the migration metalwork, because precious stones during migration were not faceted, they were cabochons, they were polished. So while a faceted stone reflects light, cabochon absorbs light and as if shines from within. And it is the same identical technique that the tribes used to decorate their weapons or their armor with cabochons right here. And here we see the exact same technique on these Gospels, with all the precious stones done as cabochons, and the setting is that of the migration setting. Cross in the middle, this is all beaten gold with Christ conveyed on the front page, very much as a non-suffering Christ, the divine Christ as opposed to human Christ, and various angels surrounding him, again with cabochon stones. I mean, this is a spectacular cover, a priceless treasure, in addition to, of course, what's inside, which is even more priceless. We have now looked at the manuscripts under Charlemagne and his successors, and we'll proceed to architecture. Because, as I mentioned before, Charlemagne went to Italy 3 times, was extremely impressed by what he had seen of the remnants of the Roman Empire, and also of Ravenna. He so much fell in love with San Vitale in Ravenna, if you remember from the Byzantine lectures, that he wished to have the exact same building in Aachen, in Aix-la-Chapelle, which was his capital. This is all reconstruction. The chapel itself, Charlemagne's royal chapel, has survived and can be visited in Aachen, but his palace did not survive. So this is the recreation of what it may have been like at the time. His palace and various secondary buildings around the palace, and then the royal chapel would be adjacent to the royal palace and would, of course, serve as an ecclesiastical building where Charlemagne and his court would conduct ecclesiastical ceremonies. Now, the chapel was constructed around the year 800, so it began in 792, so 8 years plus 14, about 22 years it took all in all to construct the chapel. An inscription in the vault of the dome has in fact the name of the master builder, Otto of Metz. In the biography of Charlemagne by Einhard, who was his courtier and his biographer at the same time, Einhard writes that Otto was a learned man, quite possibly having read Vitruvius's books on Roman architecture. Now, Vitruvius, who was a Roman civil engineer, he was a scientist and a military engineer, author, architect, wrote his book on architecture in the 1st century BC, and that book survived. This is the interior of the palace chapel. The majority of the marbles, lots of beautiful metalworks, were in fact brought from Italy, including master craftsmen, and a number of them were Byzantine master craftsmen who worked in Ravenna, who worked for the Byzantine Empire, and Charlemagne was very anxious to have the same sort of quality. So the mosaics, the ceiling mosaics in this chapel are of tremendous quality as well. This is the comparison. This is Ravenna, remember, built, this is San Vitale in Ravenna, built during the reign of the Emperor Justinian in Italy. And this is Charlemagne's chapel that was built at the turn of the 9th century by Charlemagne. And the similarities are immediately apparent. However, what is flawless in Ravenna, one geometric shape flawlessly, gradually becomes another geometric shape. Everything is very, very fluid and very much based on the architecture, on the cement architecture of ancient Rome. Charlemagne builders did not have quite the same skill, nor did they have quite the same vision, nor was Rome nearby as it was in the case of Ravenna. And as such, Charlemagne's building is it's heavier, bulkier, less subtle than the building in Ravenna. And in fact, certain elements are less functional. Here, for instance, as you see with Ravenna, the niches, the exedrae that we see here, all have this semi-dome ceiling, which is supported by two columns. And these two columns definitely support the dome. You can see it. It rests on these two columns. If the columns were to be removed, the structure would fall down. Now, the Charlemagne builders, as you see here, repeated the two columns that we see here, but instead of building an additional exedrae and an additional semi-dome, they just placed the two columns in the outside, in the external arch. But the arch doesn't need to be supported. A perfect arch does not need anything to support it because it supports itself. So as such, these columns now, even though they visually repeat the idea of the columns in Ravenna, they in fact are not functional. They are just purely decorative columns. But the columns were probably brought from Rome, it's very possible. They are Corinthian columns. And then the columns continue on the second story here. Here they are functional. Here, in fact, they do bear weight, as you see. Here. And then the Charlemagne's throne would be located here as well. Here, the tribune would be here, and this is where Charlemagne's throne would be located. This is a section of the chapel. But also, as you see, the zebra pattern also came from Byzantium, but also Islam, because Byzantium began to use the zebra pattern. It's possible that Rome itself began to use it as well, even though I can't think of examples offhand. But the Eastern Rome certainly used zebra patterns, and then when Islamic tribes overran the Byzantine provinces and they encountered Byzantine art, which was based ultimately on Roman art, Islam too was a new religion, and they adopted Byzantine methods of architecture and Byzantine styles of architecture to their own usage. We will have a separate Islam lecture on Islam during the course of these lectures. And Islam used a zebra pattern very extensively. So it's interesting to see it appear now in Charlemagne's architecture, in Carolingian architecture. It is a spectacular chapel. And here one has mosaics, and mosaics did survive, and they are very, very spectacular. Not only Charlemagne was very eager for renewed literacy, because as he wrote once, devotion to God is all well and good, but when this devotion is expressed in illiterate sentences, that's not much of a devotion, that's disrespect for divinity. And in his keenness, in his eagerness to reintroduce literacy into his empire, he was also keen on building monasteries, numerous monasteries, because that's where learning survived, while outside the monasteries, as I had mentioned, life had degraded below the level of the beasts of burden. In monasteries, not only the monasteries had libraries where certain antique manuscripts survived, and early Christian manuscripts survived, and the monks were busy copying them. There was no original thought that existed at the time, but there was, with time, great effort in at least preserving what had survived. As such, Charlemagne was very eager to establish as many monasteries as possible, and certain architecture originated as a result of this. It will be called Carolingian, Ottonian type of architecture. This abbey church did not survive, unfortunately, but we do have a manuscript that shows us what it looked like. This is monastery of Saint Vitale in France, which was dedicated around the year 800. The abbey was founded on the site of an earlier structure, and it was Charlemagne himself who charged his son-in-law with the construction of the new abbey, to be built using absolutely the finest materials and transforming the structure into a model of religious architecture for Western European ecclesiastical construction. It was destroyed by Norman invaders in the 9th century, later restored, rebuilt. Well, today it's a Baroque structure. What you see here are sort of blocks that one plays with as a child. There are blocks that are built on top of the other, whether they're rectangular blocks or cylindrical blocks. The blocks are put next to one another, on top of one another, and that's how the structure is built, right here. As we saw with St. Peter in Rome, the original idea comes from a Roman basilica and a Roman forum. This is a simple example. It's a reconstruction again of what the Roman basilica and forum in the Roman town of London may have looked like around 120 AD. The basilica, remember I may have mentioned it, acted as a civil center, as a civic center that contained law courts, administrations, assemblies, could be treasury. A basilica could also contain shops, schools. There would be temples to local and Roman deities around. And then so here's the basilica, and the Roman forum would be attached to it, and the whole thing would be a civic center. What happened here, you see, is this is the cloister that was based on the former Roman forum, and here the basilica augmented for the purposes, for ecclesiastic purposes. In Rome itself, it would of course be even more extensive, and today, however, there's an abbey church at Corvey in Germany that gives us an idea of what this church may have looked like. And the west part of the church was called Westworks. That's what the Westwork. And this structure, in fact, does go back to the original Carolingian era, while the Carolingian abbey itself is only preserved as archaeological remains. And this too, as you see, is articulated as if with blocks. It's beautifully articulated. It's divided into 3 parts. There are bell towers right here, and then the third part here with the porch projecting through it, and then it divided into 3 windows here as in Trinity. It is a genuine creation of this period, and as I said, its articulation, its decoration very much convey Carolingian desire for order, for reformation, for clarity, also for control. And under Charlemagne and his successors, it achieved all this. It also achieved the propagation of Christian beliefs and re-education of the clergy. The monasteries that Charlemagne had designed looked something like this. In the middle would be the church itself, the basilica. In this case, the bell towers are separate. Here the bell towers will become part of the westwork. Here they are separate, and then around the monasteries are all sorts of secondary buildings, because a monastery was a small town and it existed through self-production. It had everything. It had gardens, it had vineyards, it had vineyards outside the monastery. The monks were carpenters, the monks were metal workers, it had cattle, it had everything. Here is another rendering of the same, of the monastery of St. Gall that was built during the time of Charlemagne. It doesn't exist anymore, but we do have a plan. I know the plan is very confusing here, but here is our basilica. And then it would have a hostel for pilgrims. It had kitchens, guest houses, abbot's house, a place for bloodletting next to whatever physicians. The monks were also physicians. Infirmary. It would have a place for novitiates. It had cemetery that also served as an orchard because the ground was very fertile. Vegetable gardens, poultry, granary, bakery, brewery. They had horses, they had cows, pigs, goats, sheep, servants in that order. There were a hospice for the poor as well. On the southern part of the church they would have the cloister where monks could walk and meditate, a refectory where they would take their meals, latrines, baths, artisan workshops. Monastery was entirely self-sufficient. There's a brilliant film that came out in 1986 with Sean Connery. It's based on a book called The Name of the Rose by a remarkable Italian writer. His name is Umberto Eco, and it's a mystery. And it is based the story takes place in a medieval monastery, and the film shows you everything. It shows the life of a monastery absolutely brilliantly, while the monks die of mysterious causes. And here is Sean Connery acting as a sleuth with Christian Slater as his apprentice. Really wonderful film, very worthwhile. One of the reasons so many reforms could be introduced and were successful, in addition to Charlemagne being, of course, a remarkable human being, one of those extraordinary leaders that history sees once in a while, but his incredible longevity as well. I mean, he was there almost 50 years, 50, 60 years. When he died, the empire was divided between his three grandsons, actually. Emperor Lothar got the Middle Kingdom and Italy, right here, the Netherlands, and then what today is Switzerland, and then Italy. Louis the German got the the eastern part, and then Charles the Bold got the western part. And for better or worse, with changes and then return to the original, that's how it stayed. This is where our Germany is, this is France, and then Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy. So the division into these lands after Charlemagne's death determined the division of Europe, in fact, for centuries to come. What will also happen after the death of Charlemagne in the 9th century is the new wave of invasions. We saw the invasions of the 5th and the 4th centuries then people settled down, then they established their Ostrogothic, Visigothic, Vandal kingdoms. Christianity was making very slow inroads into these kingdoms, and missionaries were converting these Germanic peoples. It seemed that things were going well now with Charlemagne's reforms, and future development will ensue. However, exactly at that moment, the new wave of invasions came, this time from Norway and Denmark. Sweden also, they're the same people, but the invaders from Sweden went to Russia at the same time. So they all went to Russia. Norway and Denmark went west, and then conquered the lands of northern France, and of course the British Isles. So it was all plunged back into despair, but not for as long as was the case after the first wave of invasions, because towards the year 900, a new dynasty, this time not Carolingian dynasty but the Saxon dynasty, will emerge with the person of Otto I. And he was a German king from 936, and then Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire from 962 to 973. Again, another very, very long reign. But as in the case with Charlemagne, he very much felt he too needed to cross the Alps and be crowned by the Pope, the crowned emperor. Otto inherited the Duchy of Saxony and the kingship of the Germans upon the death of his father, but then just as Charlemagne inherited his throne through his father and then went on reforming it, so did Otto I. Not only he reformed the lands, but he also transformed the Roman Catholic Church in Germany to strengthen the royal office. He subjected the clergy to his personal rule. Now, this will later be proven to be a can of worms, because in the later Middle Ages, when popes become stronger, because at this point they don't have an army, they are popes of Rome, but they needed the Frankish army to fight their battles against their foe. And at this point, whether the Frankish army or the Franks were also Germanic tribes as well, they are considerably stronger. They have the military, and popes do not. However, with the reacquired strength in the later Middle Ages, there will be a very, very serious encounter between popes and emperors as to who is more important, whether it is the emperor who is more important or pope is more important. The popes, of course, will claim supremacy because of that Christmas day in the year 800 when Charlemagne came to become emperor at the hands of the Pope. So the popes will claim that they have the supreme authority of investiture, of investing lay rulers with divine authority. Whereas, of course, the emperors will strongly disagree. At this point, popes can do nothing, and Otto subjugated the clergy to his own personal control, as was in fact the case in the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor was administrative head, military head, political head, but also ecclesiastical head. This Otto I married an Italian princess by the name of Adelaide, whose story is very fascinating. By the age of 20, she had been imprisoned, married, saved, imprisoned again, husband died, then appealed to Otto I, who was about 20 years older. He rescued her and then married her, and then they proceeded to have a number of children and a very happy marriage. There's this delightful image of the two of them. The image was created in the 13th century in the Cathedral of Meissen in Germany. Here they are. She is smiling at him. She was an extraordinary woman, while he is portrayed as indecisive and certainly wanting her advice. Otto I will be followed by Otto II, Otto III. Otto II will be very short-lived, but he will marry a Byzantine princess, which is why his own son, Otto III, will claim imperialship over both Eastern Empire and the West as well. Under Otto II, St. Bernward was the 13th bishop of a town, of a community of Hildesheim, which was a very important community at the time. He also came from royal roots and was also a relative to the emperors. He became chaplain at the imperial court and was shortly afterwards appointed by the Byzantine princess, who was at that point empress, her husband having died, and the regent to her son Otto III, who in fact spent most of his life in Rome. He was an extremely important man, and he also very much in the wake of Charlemagne and Otto, and both Ottos, was a builder and wished to have as many ecclesiastical buildings built as possible. Also wished to imitate ancient Rome, and then his student Otto III, as I said, will spend most of his life in Rome as the center of civilization that he felt it was. So this architecture that appeared under Charlemagne and under the Ottos is called the Carolingian Ottonian architecture, because the Ottos and the buildings under them will continue in the Carolingian vein of these blocks. And here you see the Benedictine Monastery at Hildesheim, that Saint Bernward built on a hill that was connected by legend to Saint Michael, and as a result this monastery is dedicated to Saint Michael. And again you see these blocks. In this case now the bell towers are moved to the transept, you see here, and attached at the transept. But it's very easy to read the building's articulation from the outside. Here is the choir, there's the apse, there's the ambulatory that goes around the apse, the clerestory windows above the choir, the transept tower in the middle, again sort of a square block. These very stark bell towers on each side with very clever construction. Please observe that while in the first section it is an octagonal structure, then octagonal structure is separated by a cornice from its second story, which is in fact round. But the eye travels effortlessly from an octagonal form to a round form, particularly given the cornice that separates them. So you can almost imagine the architect playing with the blocks and thinking, the tower, yes, I know perhaps should be round, but octagonal is wonderful also. Why not do both of them and just make it aesthetically pleasing using both forms. Here it is. It was destroyed in Second World War, but then entirely rebuilt according to the original. And that's what we see today. This is the entry here, actually, as in the original Roman basilicas, from the sides, as you see here, whereas the front, this is the west work and east work right there. This is our tower, octagonal at first, then, as you see, a round tower, and a clerestory here, the side aisles, and another apse on the west as in the east. Here are the plans, and this is the church as you can see it from the outside. There's a nave right here, and a nave, the word comes from a Latin word for a ship, with two side aisles on each side. Here are the entrances, and then the raised choir right here. This is the interior. The ceiling was recreated. The walls today are bare between the clerestory and the naval arcade. These walls are there. This space, however, will prove very important later on as time goes by. And we see the zebra stripes here too. This is one end of the church, and here is the other end of the church with the transept, as you see here. And the reason it does look very new is because it was reconstructed. The nave is articulated, as you see, with 3 bays. Each bay is separated from the next by a pier. A pier is a rectilinear column like this, and then the columns, and then each bay in itself is also divided into 3 parts by columns. The columns here that you see are the ones that survived. These columns here that you see are new, are the replacement for the original columns. It seems we have a sketch, so it seems that between the clerestory and the naval arcade there were frescoes, but these frescoes were not reproduced. A similar building that did survive is the church of Kyriakos, and it is also in Germany, and here it is, as you see. What they had done here, which is very, very significant, and is the space. Here you see the space between the clerestory windows and the naval arcade. Here is the space under a roof that goes over the side aisle. So what they did in St. Kyriakos is that they opened up that space, sort of as we open closet space under the staircase in the house, because otherwise it's just lost space. So builders today make a little door, and you can use it as a storage space. Or if the space is quite large, as well in the case of Harry Potter, somebody can live in that storage space, so to speak. This is the same thing. So they cut open that space under the roof and created a gallery, which is a very significant development in architecture. And this church, as I said, survives today down to its westworks, eastworks, and also is done in these blocks, as were so popular in Carolingian, Ottonian architecture, as you see here. Our Bishop Bernward was very ambitious, as you see, and he also went to Rome, and he saw a number of bronze doors that the Romans loved so much, and decided to create a pair of bronze doors, which was an extremely ambitious project, and which ended up to be the first bronze doors of the Middle Ages. And here they are. They are the bronze doors of the Hildesheim Cathedral. They consist of 2 registers. One is the Old Testament, the other register is the New Testament. And in the Christian keenness always to parallel the two, they are also parallel. And here in this slide you can see the parallel. So the formation of Eve here is paralleled to Noli Me tangere, don't touch me. In other words, paradise lost and then paradise regained. Eve presented to Adam is parallel to 3 Marys at the tomb. In other words, salutations, etc. The most important thing here is not even so much the content as the fact that these bronze doors were cast, and that at the time there was technology enough to cast them. They may appear to us very simplistic, but for the time they were quite extraordinary. In fact, they somewhat remind us of that Carolingian ruler on horseback that we had seen. This is an example of accusation and judgment of Adam and Eve, and in a way it's kind of charming, because here's God appearing from beyond the lattice and pointing the finger at Adam, accusing Adam of the original sin. Whereas Adam immediately, without taking upon himself the guilt, he immediately points at Eve. And then Eve immediately points at what appears like a chicken, but in fact is supposed to be a snake. These are done in relief. It's called relief sculpture, when imagery is projected from the background, as opposed to a sculpture that can be walked around, as was the case with that Carolingian ruler on a horse. This, we only see it from the front, and it's only meant to be seen from the front, whereas a sculpture in the round can be seen from all sides, right here. And this is temptation and fall. Here is Adam and Eve, and here is the snake, right here. The fact of these bronze doors having been created, as I emphasized before and emphasizing again, is very, very important. Our Bishop Bernward also commissioned a column. What he wanted to commission, he wanted something like a very famous Roman column. It was done under the reign of the Emperor Trajan, and it's called the Column of Trajan in Rome. It was done in the early 2nd century AD, and it commemorated the victories of the Emperor Trajan in Dacia, which is today Romania. It is a very, very careful depiction of all stages of battles and occupation of the region. And this is what Bernward wanted. It never came to fruition, so instead he had a smaller column created, 1/10 in fact of the Trajan's column, and it sits in Hildesheim Cathedral. Originally it sat right here, as you see, and what it depicts is the life of Christ. So just as the column of Trajan depicts Trajan's conquests, this column depicts life of Christ. It is the original, it survived, it sat in the Trajan Forum, and we saw the London Basilica and Forum that Romans built. This is a more elaborate example of the Romans had in the city itself. So this is the basilica with the 2 apses right here. This is the Roman Forum, and then behind is the temple, right there. And here sat the column between the 2 libraries. So the Christians, essentially, they'll take that same design, they'll take the basilica, turn the basilica into a religious building, and then place it either perpendicularly to the cloister or alongside the cloister. Didn't matter, but the idea is the same: shrink the Roman Forum to make it into a cloister. Also, under the Ottos, continued the manuscript illumination, and here the manuscript that was done under Otto III, the grandson of Otto I. This one, remember, lived in Rome. And here, on both sides, what we see is Otto enthroned. And he is receiving the homage from different parts of his empire. And the empire includes the Slavic countries, like for our benefit, everything is written here. So the Slavic countries here, then Germania, Germany, here, Gallia, which is France, and Rome itself, which is, and by Rome, presumably is also meant the Eastern Empire of Rome as well. So these are the personifications of these lands, and they are done in a somewhat Byzantine manner, more schematic even than the Byzantine, but these striations that you see and the fluid lines remind us to a certain extent of Byzantine art, which is not surprising because, as I said, Otto III is living in Rome. His mother is a Byzantine princess, and Ravenna is not far away. Here he is himself dressed in purple for the most part with a green cape, and on each side, just as in our Justinian mosaic, if you remember, on one side of him are his administrators and military commanders, and on the other side are the clergy. So this all taken from previous tradition. There is an attempt made here at portraying realistic imagery. The attempt obviously has failed, but nevertheless it is very compelling in what it represents, and even though it is more stylistic than it is realistic, we see exactly what is the attempt of the artist to represent Otto as the ruler of the orb with the scepter and the ruler of all provinces. Here is the close-up so you can see it better. A tradition was developing at the time whereby architectural capitals were losing their traditional Greek conventions, and often the master craftsmen would introduce scenes from their own folklore, from their own folklore past, which we will see. But it's interesting that in this image, something like this is represented, especially with the Ottos who were so keen on reviving the classicizing methods. And last but not least, here is a life-size sculpture of a crucified Christ. It's called Giro Crucifix. It's that Saint Bishop Giro, and this perhaps is the first vivid depiction of suffering Christ. So far, we had seen Christ in majesty, and even when he was on the cross, he was still Christ in majesty, the divine Christ who has nothing human about him, who does not feel human pain. Well, here he does. He is depicted, he's crucified, his shoulder blades have been torn from the sockets. His belly is extended from pain and misery. The face also exemplifies pain. The little streaks on the forehead are done with red paint to show blood. There used to be the crown of thorns on his head. This is a reliquary. One can open up the head and there would be a relic inside. And the body is depicted as quite heavy. And the weight of the body, in fact, is depicted very, very vividly. Compared to this small panel, if you remember from our lecture on the early Christian art, where Christ is portrayed as triumphant, even though on the cross. So there's a big difference here between the 5th century representation and well, the 10th century representation of Christ, and from now on Christ will always be represented as the suffering Christ. Thus we came to the end of this early period in our studies of the Middle Ages, and I will see you soon. Thank you.